Somewhere in the darkness of a Spanish cave, a child's neck bone has waited nearly 1,000,000 years to tell its story. The cuts on it are precise. They were made at the exact points needed to remove a human head. Not by an animal, by another human being. This is not a story from a horror film. It is a story written in bone, and archaeologists have spent decades learning to read it. Cannibalism is one of the oldest and most disturbing chapters in the human story. It is also one of the most misunderstood. For centuries, tales of man-eating savages were used more as propaganda and as science. Today, real archaeological evidence tells a very different, far more complicated story. Some of it points to desperate survival. Some of it points to elaborate, symbolic ritual. And in many cases, scientists still cannot agree which one they are looking at. This is the story of what the bones actually say. Let's start with the basics. Cannibalism means the consumption of human flesh by other humans. In archaeology, researchers separate it into different categories. Survival cannibalism happens under extreme starvation, when there is no other source of food. Ritual cannibalism is tied to belief systems, warning practices, or spiritual customs. Some researchers also describe cannibalism used as a weapon, meant to terrify rival groups. The challenge is that bones rarely announce which category they belong to. Archaeologists have to reconstruct the story piece by piece. So how do scientists actually prove that cannibalism happened? They cannot simply see it happen. They have to read the evidence left on the bones themselves. The first clue is cut marks, the same kind left by stone tools when butchering an animal. Researchers compare these marks directly to marks found on hunted game from the same site. The second clue is percussion damage, where bones were deliberately smashed open. This is usually done to reach the marrow and fat hidden inside. The third clue is human tooth marks, physical evidence that human teeth stood on human bone. Scientists can also look for pot polish, a smoothing effect caused by bones being boiled or stirred in cooking vessels. Sometimes, the proof goes even further, into biochemistry. At one American site, researchers tested a piece of ancient human waste for a muscle protein called myoglobin. They found human myoglobin, meaning someone had genuinely eaten human muscle tissue. No single mark proves cannibalism on its own. Archaeologists look for a whole pattern, one that matches how animals were butchered at the very same site. Now let's go back to the very beginning. The oldest confirmed evidence of cannibalism in the human story comes from Spain. The site is called Gran Dolina, part of the Atapuerca cave system. The remains belong to Homo antecessor, an early human relative that lived hundreds of thousands of years before us. Researchers date this evidence to more than 800,000 years ago. Recent excavations even uncovered the vertebra of a toddler, no older than 5, showing precise cut marks from decapitation. Palmira Saladi, one of the lead researchers at the site, has described the cuts as remarkably precise for the child's age. Around 30% of the human bones recovered from this cave layer show similar cutting and butchery marks. The human remains were mixed in with animal bones processed in exactly the same way. This suggests that, for these early humans, other members of their own species or sometimes simply another source of meat. Researchers describe this as a repeated, almost routine behavior, not a single isolated event. Whether this reflects warfare between rival groups or a form of nutritional strategy, still debated, but it remains, to this day, the earliest solid evidence of hominin cannibalism ever discovered. Let's move forward in time, to France, and to the Neanderthals. At a cave called Mullagerki, archaeologists found the remains of at least 6 Neanderthal individuals. The bones date back roughly 100,000 years. Excavation leader Albin de Fleur, working alongside anthropologist Tim White, studied the remains in extraordinary detail. The Neanderthal bones were scattered across the cave floor, mixed among deer bones. Both sets of bones had been defleshed with stone tools. Both had been broken open with a hammerstone and an anvil stone, in exactly the same manner. There was no separate burial for the human remains. There was no sign that the bodies were treated with special reverence. This pattern strongly suggested that, at Mullagerki, Neanderthals had processed their own dead exactly as they processed animal prey. Some researchers argue this points to survival cannibalism during a period of resource scarcity. Other scholars remain cautious, noting that cut marks alone cannot always rule out alternative explanations, like ritual defleshing before burial. Even decades later, Debate about the deeper meaning behind these Neanderthal bones continues. Now to a very different kind of case, one where the evidence points away from hunger and towards something far more symbolic. Gough's Cave sits inside Cheddar Gorge, in southwest England. Around 15,000 years ago, during the last ice age, a group of hunter-gatherers occupied this cave. Archaeologists uncovered the remains of at least 5 people, including 2 teenagers and a very young child. Every one of these individuals shows extensive evidence of cannibalism. Long bones were cracked open and gnawed for marrow. Ribs were stripped clean by human teeth, but the most extraordinary discovery involves the skulls. 3 skulls from Gough's Cave were carefully shaped into cups or bowls. Researcher Sylvia Bayo, of London's Natural History Museum, has studied this process in painstaking detail. The soft tissue was meticulously removed from each skull almost immediately after death. The facial bones and base of the skull were carefully cut away. The remaining bone was then shaped and smoothed into a rounded container. This is currently the earliest directly dated example of skull cup making anywhere in the archaeological record. One arm bone from the site bears something even stranger, a deliberate zigzag pattern of engraved lines. These marks were carved into a part of the arm with no muscle, meaning they were not simply cuts for removing meat. Daya and her colleagues argue this points to something symbolic, perhaps part of a mortuary ritual rather than an act of desperate survival. Not every archaeologist agrees with that interpretation. Some researchers believe practical processing could still explain much of the evidence, but everyone agrees the skull cups themselves were intentionally manufactured. Someone invested considerable time creating them. That alone tells us these objects carried meaning beyond simple nutrition. Cannibalism was not always about survival. Sometimes it may have expressed memory, identity, or respect for the dead. This idea appears in many societies far beyond prehistoric Europe. One famous historical example comes from the Fur people of Papua New Guinea. Their funerary practice, called endocannibalism, involved consuming deceased relatives as an act of mourning. To outsiders, the practice appeared horrifying. To the Fur themselves, it represented love, grief, and spiritual responsibility. No archaeological evidence alone could reveal those beliefs. Without historical accounts, the bones would only tell part of the story. That is one reason archaeologists hesitate before assigning motives. The bones preserve actions, they rarely preserve intentions. That distinction is one of the biggest challenges in archaeology. Even today, new discoveries continue to reshape our understanding. Each new fossil has the potential to challenge everything we thought we knew. Scientists no longer ask only whether cannibalism occurred. They ask why it happened. Was it driven by hunger, by warfare, by ritual, or by reasons we may never fully understand? The evidence continues to accumulate. New analytical techniques continue to improve, and every few years, another discovery forces experts to reconsider old assumptions. The prehistoric world was almost certainly more complex than we once imagined. The people who lived then were not monsters. They were humans responding to circumstances we can barely imagine. Some choices may have been practical, others may have been deeply symbolic, and many will probably remain mysteries forever. The next fossil may answer one question. It may also create 10 new ones. That is how science works. Each answer leads to another investigation. And every ancient bone still has another story waiting to be told. The evidence does not ask us to celebrate cannibalism, it asks us to understand it. Because understanding uncomfortable truths is part of understanding ourselves. Our ancestors were capable of compassion. They were also capable of extraordinary violence. Those contradictions still exist in humanity today. The difference is that now we can study the past instead of repeating it blindly. Every cut mark, every broken bone, and every ancient campsite is another page in humanity's history. And archaeologists continue learning to read it. Perhaps the greatest lesson is not about cannibalism at all. It is about how science replaces fear with evidence, how careful observation replaces myth, and how even the darkest discoveries can teach us something important about being human. The bones have waited hundreds of thousands of years. Now, finally, they are beginning to speak. If you enjoyed this journey into humanity's deepest past, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more documentaries exploring archaeology, ancient civilizations, and the hidden history of our species. There is still much more waiting beneath the ground, and every discovery brings us one step closer to understanding who we really are.